During Trump's first term, yes, we experienced a trade war and a technology war. It spread into many different areas. It wasn't limited to just trade. But at the end of the day, what had happened up until before the pandemic? Well, both sides had reached a trade agreement and the Phase 1 deal had been signed. In fact, despite all the criticism, the Trump administration in China had managed to find common ground for an agreement.
In the final years of Trump's term, a Phase 1 agreement was made. And this Phase 1 agreement was largely about the Trump administration getting what it wanted from China. If you look at the agreement, it mostly addressed Trump's complaints, like, the Chinese aren't buying enough from us, we don't have enough access to the Chinese market, they should buy more from us, and it was China's commitment to respond to those demands.
In this sense, China also realized something. Trump is also a figure you can understand. In some ways, he's unpredictable, but because he's extremely pragmatic and approaches foreign policy like a businessman, you can reach an agreement with him on the right terms. He also gave signals that you could come to an agreement.
Joe. After me, job. With Biden taking the presidential seat, a new chapter began in the relationship between the United States and China. Biden preferred to take strategic steps behind the scenes rather than having big fights in front of the media. The fight to protect American industry against China's massive power in technological products like electric cars, batteries, and solar panels continued at full speed. In 2022, China produced 60% of the world's electric vehicles and 70% of their batteries. In addition, it dominated 80% of the global solar panel market. The Biden administration tried to resist this pressure by increasing tariffs and making multi-billion-dollar investments to encourage domestic production. On the surface, the river's waters seemed calm, but beneath, the power struggle between the two giants continued with full intensity.
Actually, after Trump, when Biden came in, there wasn't much change in policies regarding China. In fact, some measures that didn't exist during the Trump era were actually introduced under Biden. So, rather than a change or a break, I think it's more accurate to talk about continuity and consistency here.
When the Biden administration took over, they not only kept these tariffs, but also added an extra $18 billion worth of tariffs. Recently, tariffs of up to 100% are being imposed on electric vehicles. We see that the Biden administration is pursuing an intense strategy to contain China, especially in semiconductors.
While it was expected that Biden, or rather the Biden administration, would establish much more institutional relationships, in reality, during Biden's term, China-US relations have been pretty much idling, largely continuing on the foundation laid during the Trump era.
There are very few points where there is consensus. But perhaps the most fundamental of those points of consensus is China. Both Democrats and Republicans see China's rise as a dangerous trend in terms of America's strategic interests.
The Biden administration's team, and even Obama's, who was said to have the most liberal, the most moderate policies, especially in certain areas, even Obama's China team of advisors, their level of hawkishness is about the same. But we see that the only foreign policy issue that unites both the American public and Congress is China.
The biggest tension of the Biden era began with the flare-up of a 76-year-old issue. In the summer of 2022, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. While the visit carried messages of freedom and democracy from Washington, the reaction coming from Beijing was very different. Military exercises, warplanes filling the sky, and a tense standoff in the Taiwan Strait. The whole world was fixated on the showdown taking place on this small island.
From China's perspective, the Taiwan issue is not an area where China can back down. This is the country that has fought in 2 world wars and emerged victorious against Japan. To sum it up very quickly, it starts its own civil war. On one side was the Kuomintang Nationalist Party, and on the other side was the Communist Party, and by 1949, the Communist Party controlled mainland China. The Nationalist Party retreated to Taiwan.
In 1979, a compromise was reached with Taiwan through the signing of 3 fundamental documents. Yes, in principle, China was of course not going to recognize Taiwan as a separate state. No other country was going to recognize it either. According to China's claim, though, it was actually accepted by both sides that Taiwan should have a special status.
So, from Beijing's perspective, no matter if 70 years pass or even 170 years pass, the Taiwan issue remains the same. As an unresolved chapter of the Chinese Civil War, it creates a serious problem of political legitimacy there.
Maybe, if Taiwan is going to be a country, it could be like a brand new Syria for that region, a Syria of the region, so to speak. Why Taiwan? Because perhaps the world's richest company is located there, in an environment where the most important strategic materials of this era, including rare elements, are at stake. That's where NVIDIA is, the company that produces microchips, advanced computers, and quantum computers.
Even though China wants Taiwan to be considered together with itself, and if you also take into account that there were some high-level visits during the Democratic Party era, we can see that, as things have gradually developed, Taiwan's chip production, reaching up to 90%, has become a situation that is troubling the United States.
Taiwan is not something you can keep confined to a purely regional scale. It could easily spark a serious global conflict. This is a process that needs to be managed with great care.
How many American presidents has Xi Jinping seen since 2012? He knows all their policies, he knows their methods. And it's not just Xi Jinping, China as a whole knows and is taking precautions. They're developing policies accordingly. In fact, this can be seen as an advantage of China's political system for China itself.
China has established bilateral strategic relations with almost all oil and natural gas producing countries. And these connections aren't ones that can be easily broken.
Especially the countries that are primarily located in its own periphery. Countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, for example, are important destinations for investment. Beyond that, we also see investments in more distant regions, like the Balkans, in countries such as Serbia and Hungary.
For example, Africa is one of these places. No one can deny China's presence there. We can talk about an incredible Chinese presence. With all its infrastructure investments and so on, China is one of the leading countries in Africa.
China has a strategy to maintain its own size and, at the same time, to expand not through territory but through the economy. What does that mean? For example, today, many countries in Africa have already fallen under China's hegemony.
I mean, from the year 2000 until today, they have made 1,300 separate loan agreements and have given loans to Africa totaling $182 billion. And let me tell you something interesting here. China has even recorded $136 billion of that amount as a negative entry on its own state balance sheet. In other words, they took on the risk from the start that this money might not be paid back. The future of the global electronics industry is, in a way, dependent on coltan production. Therefore, China's investments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where coltan is found, are incredibly high. From the renovation of the port to the operation of the mines, and even the establishment of many factories in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Chinese are always at the forefront and in a leading position.
What is China doing differently? Well, first of all, I think China, as a non-Western power, looks at the world from a different perspective, and that's exactly why it's perceived differently by other countries around the world.
France halted all its investments in Guinea in exchange for recognizing Guinea's independence. When I went to Conakry, Guinea, there was a museum about this topic, and when I visited that museum, the sociologist who was an expert on the subject told me the following. He said that they dismantled the electrical wiring in our elementary schools and left. In the intensive care units of our hospitals, they removed the electrical systems, transformers, and cables and left. Many patients had to die because they couldn't get oxygen, because there was no electricity. In response to this, China stepped in. China said, "I can solve your electricity problem here. Let me build a dam." They built a dam worth $526 million, and suddenly, while Guinea couldn't even find electricity before, it became a country that exports electricity to neighboring countries. So, China gains new favor.
China's way of working is a bit different. As far as I know, especially in the countries where it invests, China brings its own workers and workforce to those countries. So, it doesn't really create additional employment there.
China has a policy of strictly insisting on using its own engineers, its own foremen, as well as its own workers, especially in construction activities in the countries where it invests. And for this reason, we see that the Chinatowns we see on our televisions in America, England, or any location in Europe have also been established in many different parts of the world.
In the traditional sense, when we think of foreign investment, we expect that after a factory is built, the local people in that area will be employed. The Chinese model is a bit different. They bring their own Chinese workers and carry out the process and investments there with them.
They try to include countries with similar political stances, countries whose political destinies resemble their own, into this partnership. In this sense, they are making a tremendous effort in trying to expand the channels that feed their own economy. Because China suffered a serious heart attack due to the American offensive. America created a heart attack effect on China's economy. And China is bypassing the American heart attack by opening up new trade routes with Africa.
Get out of the way.
When Trump's election became certain, I took a look at the atmosphere inside China. But of course, the official Chinese discourse is extremely tight-lipped on these matters. If you were to ask a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry whether they would prefer another term with Biden or a new Trump era, they would probably give a very vague answer to that question.
In a second Trump term, there will be much harsher trade measures against China implemented in the short term. For example, Trump made this clear during his election campaign. During his campaign, he stated that he would impose an additional 60% tariff on all product groups imported from China.
In other words, the competition between the United States and China is getting more intense by the day, and in my opinion, this rivalry will only get tougher. So who will come out on top? Of course, we're not fortune tellers, so we can't really know that.
In a second term under the Trump administration, yes, what we've observed, actually what we've seen, and when we compare it to the first term, we think these aggressive policies will continue. But it's really important to emphasize this. This also points to the possibility that in these negotiations, in this give-and-take balance, in other words, in the United States give-and-take approach, there could be an open door left for compromise.
Even the most ordinary handshake with China is seen as something almost criminal. This is the kind of attitude that exists right now in certain circles of American politics. But there will also be figures like Elon Musk, someone who manufactures most of his electric cars in Shanghai, frequently visits China, and is always warmly received whenever he goes there.
Elon Musk gave significant support to Trump during the election period. Both financially and through his platform, formerly known as Twitter, now X, he provided support. And right now, he has taken a very ambitious position in the government regarding the reorganization of the American administration.
Elon Musk has a huge factory in Shanghai. Currently, he is also receiving some new incentives from the Chinese government. And China is also supporting that company for electric vehicles and developing that ecosystem, so they are also, well, keeping track of their own interests. So there is a situation of mutual benefit and mutual dependence. Therefore, it's clear that Elon Musk will have influence in the eyes of Trump.
That being said, at its core, there is a very serious and deep conflict of interest between the China policy that Trump wants to pursue and Elon Musk's, especially commercial interests, specifically his commercial interests through Tesla. Because Trump is threatening China with trade protection measures, whereas Elon Musk's preference is exactly the opposite. In other words, he wants the cars produced in China to be sold easily within China and also for Tesla cars to be exported from there to global markets.
The gentleman who was the Communist Party secretary of Shanghai when the Shanghai factory was opened is now the Prime Minister of China. He is someone who has significant connections and is respected both at the provincial level and within the central government in China. I can't really predict how he will serve as a balancing factor in relations with China.
Just like in 2001, for years Trump took on the country's social problems and unemployment issues himself, which in turn contributed to social development in China. What did he do? He moved factories over there because it was cheaper, but on the other hand, he was dealing with unemployment at home. He gave up on that. Now he's calling them back. It's clear that this process will continue.
Up until now, why were so many countries and, in fact, the multinational companies driving this integration going to China? They were going to China in search of efficiency, economic efficiency. In other words, the idea was, let's go and do our manufacturing in China, and then we can sell our products to the world with higher margins. That's how they were able to invest in China. Now, this has changed.
Frankly, just as some gaps created by China in certain areas and the shifts in value chains to Turkey during the China-America rivalry, Turkey could also offer the opportunity for value investments to shift here. But Turkey needs to do some work on this, make a demand, and have some homework prepared.
The world stage has turned into an arena where two giants fiercely compete for economic, technological, and political supremacy. China continues to act like a piranha that instills fear in its surroundings. The United States, on the other hand, is determined to maintain its dominance as a superpower. So, how will the future shape this equation? How much further will China expand its sphere of economic influence? What kind of policy will Trump pursue in his second term? The answers to these questions will become clear in the coming years. No matter what happens, it's certain that we're facing an unchanging reality. China is no longer a distant place for anyone. The piranha is right under our noses, closer and more ambitious than ever before.